It began in darkness. The kind of darkness that swallows everything. Sound, shape, even fear itself. The kind of darkness you only find on a battlefield at night, where death hides behind silence. Below that black sky, the front lines of the Eastern Front stretched for miles, a frozen scar across the world. German soldiers huddled in their trenches, cigarettes glowing faintly in the cold, the air thick with gunpowder and nerves. For a brief moment, everything was still, and then came a sound, a soft, strange whisper, like wind brushing through dry grass. It was faint, almost innocent. Some soldiers thought it was a bird, others thought it was the wind, but those who had heard it before knew better. They looked up, eyes searching the sky. Nothing. No silhouettes, no engines, just stars. And then a flash, followed by the sharp thunder of explosions tearing through the night. Ammunition depots erupted in flame. Vehicles went up like candles. Panic rippled through the camp as the whisper grew louder, sweeping overhead. The Germans had a name for them, Die Nachthexen, the night witches. To the men below they seemed supernatural, invisible phantoms who appeared without warning, dropped their bombs with uncanny precision, and vanished into the dark. But the truth was even more unbelievable. They were young women, Soviet pilots, barely out of their teens, flying outdated biplanes built of plywood and canvas, aircraft so fragile that a single bullet could ignite them. And yet, they flew straight into the teeth of German defenses night after night, striking with surgical precision and vanishing before anyone could react. Their story didn't begin in glory. It began in desperation. In 1941, the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. Hitler's armies had invaded under Operation Barbarossa, advancing faster than anyone believed possible. In just months, entire Soviet divisions were wiped out. Kiev fell. Smolensk fell. German tanks were rolling toward Moscow. Every able-bodied man was being thrown into battle. Factories converted overnight into war machines. And yet, half the population, the women, were told their duty was at home. To nurse, to build, to wait. But one woman refused to wait. Her name was Marina Raskova, a name already etched into Soviet legend. She was the Soviet Union's first female navigator, a record-breaking aviator who had once survived days lost in the Siberian wilderness after a crash landing. To the public, she was a symbol of courage. To the military, a valuable mind. When the Germans invaded, Raskova began receiving letters from women all over the country, hundreds, then thousands. Students, teachers, factory workers, even athletes, all begging for a chance to fight, to fly, to defend their homeland. Every letter carried the same message: let us serve. Raskova knew the Soviet command would never allow it easily, but she also knew how to use her fame. She petitioned every connection she had, generals, party officials, even Stalin himself. And she didn't ask politely. She demanded it. Late in 1941, as Moscow prepared for siege, Stalin finally agreed. 3 all-female aviation regiments would be created, 1 for fighters, 1 for heavy bombers, and 1 for light night bombers. The latter would become Raskova's personal project, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Recruitment began almost immediately. Word spread through flight schools and universities. Women pilots were needed. The response was overwhelming. Girls as young as 17 volunteered. Some lied about their age just to join. They arrived at the Engels Military Aviation School, a frozen patch of earth near the Volga River, carrying suitcases, notebooks, and dreams. Many had never been away from home. They wore men's uniforms 2 sizes too large, belts cinched tight around their waists, boots stuffed with rags to fit. But none of it mattered. They were here to fly. The training was brutal. 12-hour days in freezing winds, studying navigation, aerodynamics, mechanics, and combat tactics. There was no favoritism, No leniency because of gender. If anything, their instructors were harsher, determined to prove that women could meet, or exceed, the standards of men. The aircraft assigned to them was the Polikarpov Po-2, a relic from another time. Built in the 1920s as a trainer, it was slow, open cockpit, and made almost entirely of wood and canvas. It had no armor, no radio, and could only carry 2 small bombs at a time. To the male pilots it was a joke, a flying coffin. But to the women of the 588th, it was freedom. It was light, nimble, and could take off and land on rough fields where heavier planes would crash. It could fly low and slow, almost skimming the treetops, invisible to radar. And when the engines were cut mid-flight, it became completely silent, gliding like a ghost. That whisper, that eerie rustling in the dark, was the sound of their wings. In the spring of 1942, the regiment was declared combat ready. The night before their first mission, they gathered in a small barracks lit by lanterns. They sang songs to calm their nerves. Some wrote letters home. Others just sat quietly, staring at their maps. They knew what awaited them. Flak guns, searchlights, German fighters, death. And yet, when the time came, every single one of them climbed into her plane. They took off in groups of 3, the small engine sputtering in the night. Their target, a German encampment near the front. They flew low, following rivers and tree lines for navigation, no instruments but a compass and their instincts. The air was freezing, their goggles fogging with breath. As they neared the target, the lead pilot raised her hand. The signal. One by one, the engines were cut. Silence. The only sound was the wind whispering through fabric wings. They glided over the sleeping camp and released their bombs. The night exploded. By the time the Germans reacted, it was too late. The women had restarted their engines and vanished into the blackness. Their first mission was a success. When they landed, the ground crews cheered. They had done what no one thought possible, struck the enemy, and returned unscathed. That night, the Night Witches were born. The next nights came harder. The first mission had proven they could do it. The second proved they would have to keep doing it, again and again, until exhaustion became routine. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment operated from makeshift airstrips near the front, nothing more than open fields carved out of frozen earth. There were no runways, no hangars, no comfort. Just mud, wind, and endless dark. Their tents leaked. Their rations froze solid. They slept in layers of wool and leather, sometimes fully dressed, ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Each night began the same way. The dull orange of sunset fading over the steppe, the low hum of engines coughing to life, the faint scent of oil and smoke. Mechanics, also women, checked every wire and bolt by hand. They patched bullet holes with fabric, replaced splintered propellers, and refueled by lantern light. There was never enough of anything. Every screw, every drop of gasoline was precious. By 10 p.m., the first flights would rise into the night. The last would land near dawn. They flew in pairs or trios, never more. One would draw fire, looping through the sky to distract anti-aircraft guns, while the others slipped in silently to drop their bombs. Each pilot carried only 2 small bombs per run, so they'd make multiple sorties per night. 6 missions, sometimes 8, sometimes more. They'd land, reload, drink a sip of water or bite of bread, and take off again before their engines cooled. Sleep was a luxury. Fear was constant. But they learned to move through it, to turn terror into instinct. The Germans never understood how they appeared so suddenly, or why they were impossible to detect. It was the plane itself, that fragile Polikarpov Po-2. The wooden frame made it invisible to radar. The slow speed kept it beneath detection thresholds, and when the women cut their engines, the only thing the enemy heard was the soft rush of wind. That whisper became their signature. It floated above the trenches just seconds before the bombs fell, a sound soldiers came to dread. Some refused to light cigarettes after dusk, afraid that even the faintest glow might draw a witch from the sky. The night witches began to master the art of silence. They'd kill their engines miles away from the target and glide, coasting low over rivers and forests, barely skimming the treetops. They flew so close to the ground that branches scratched their fuselages. From the cockpit, they could see campfires below, tiny orange dots flickering like eyes. When they released their bombs, they never looked back. There was no time to admire explosions, no safety in watching. They dropped, they climbed, and they vanished. But not every night ended cleanly. Sometimes the searchlights found them. Thin white beams slicing through the dark, sweeping like hungry fingers. Once caught, the pilots had only seconds to react. They couldn't outrun the lights, so they learned to outthink them. They'd cut power, dive, twist into impossible turns, glide in total silence until the beams drifted past, then restart the engines mid-fall and escape into the black. One pilot, Marina Raskova, recalled the feeling. When the searchlight caught us, it was like being naked in front of death. You felt it on your skin. You couldn't breathe. You just prayed you'd fall faster than their aim. On the ground, mechanics counted minutes, watching the horizon for returning shapes. Every time a plane came back, it was a small miracle. Every time one didn't, the airfield fell silent. The regiment's first losses came early that summer. 2 planes failed to return from a night raid near the Don River. No radio contact, no distress call. Just gone. They waited until sunrise, then sent search teams. But there was nothing to find. The sky had swallowed them whole. That was the moment the reality of war set in. They buried empty coffins that week, names without bodies, and yet, when night fell, the remaining pilots climbed into their planes and flew. Because that's what they had promised. Among them was Nadezhda Popova, a pilot who would become one of the regiment's legends. At 20, she had already lost her brother to the war. She joined not out of ambition, but revenge. By the end of the conflict, she would fly 852 missions, survive being shot down multiple times, and never once stop smiling. She was the one who laughed when flak shells burst near her wings, who sang over the wind to calm her navigator, and who once returned from a mission with 42 bullet holes in her plane. And not a scratch on herself. When asked later how she survived, she said simply, "Luck, I suppose." And stubbornness. Each mission took its toll. The cold was relentless. In winter, their faces would freeze under the slipstream. Frostbitten fingers bled through gloves. Their scarves stiffened with ice. They used pencils to scratch frost off their instruments mid-flight. The cockpit temperatures dropped so low that tears froze on their cheeks. And yet, they joked about it. They called themselves the Daughters of the Night. They painted stars on their planes, shared bread in silence, wrote letters on scraps of cardboard when paper ran out. They lived between fatigue and adrenaline, between life and the thin edge of oblivion. By 1943, the Night Witches had become something more than a novelty. They were a weapon. Their accuracy improved. Their raids intensified. They targeted supply lines, ammunition depots, train yards, bridges. German command began marking their flight zones on maps in red, danger areas to be avoided at night. The Luftwaffe even assigned elite squadrons to hunt them. But chasing a Po-2 was like trying to catch a falling leaf. The German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, were too fast. They'd overshoot, stall, or tear past before they could aim. Some crashed trying. The frustration grew so severe that the Germans offered an Iron Cross to any pilot who could shoot one down. Few ever did. To the Soviet High Command, these women were heroes. But on the ground, not everyone saw them that way. Many male pilots mocked them at first, the little sisters of the air, they called them. But those jokes faded quickly, because every morning when the reports came in, it was the 588th that had flown the most missions, destroyed the most targets, and suffered the least cowardice. Their commander, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, kept them disciplined but human. She treated them like soldiers, not girls. She expected perfection, and somehow they gave it. She knew every name, every voice, every silence that meant fear. And when someone didn't return, she personally wrote the letter home. The regiment's reputation spread like fire through the ranks. They were no longer the experimental women's unit. They were the Night Witches. By the summer of 1943, their name alone carried weight. German intelligence warned new recruits never to underestimate them. Even hardened officers spoke their name with caution. "If you hear a broomstick in the sky," one German soldier wrote in his diary, "it's already too late." That whisper, that soft rustle of fabric wings, had become the sound of inevitability. And the Night Witches were just getting started. By late 1943, the Night Witches had become something more than soldiers. They were a rumor wrapped in firelight, a story told by men who had seen shadows fall from the stars and lived to tell about it. The front had shifted south toward the Caucasus Mountains, and the German advance was slowing. But every inch of progress came with a price. The Soviets needed constant air support, small, precise strikes that could cripple enemy positions before dawn. And for that, the Night Witches were perfect. They flew every night, without fail. No weather, no exhaustion, no fear could stop them. If a storm rolled over the mountains, they flew through it. If fog covered the valleys, they flew lower. Their wooden planes creaked, ice formed on their wings, and still, they flew. That winter, their missions became longer and deadlier. The mountains were a death trap, unpredictable winds, freezing altitudes, and sheer cliffs that disappeared in darkness. Navigation was almost impossible. The compasses spun uselessly in magnetic interference, so they learned to read the stars and the shape of rivers below. One pilot joked that she could find a German encampment just by the way the sky smelled. "Like oil and fear," she said. It wasn't far from the truth. The regiment had become experts in improvisation. They used kitchen timers to calculate bombing runs, tore fabric from tents to patch their wings, and replaced missing bolts with nails hammered in by hand. Their resourcefulness bordered on madness, the kind that comes from living too close to danger for too long. Among them, one woman stood out. Marina Raskova, the founder of the regiment herself. Though she had helped build the unit, she hadn't been on the front lines in the early days. She had stayed behind to oversee training and organization, but as the war intensified, she requested to fly again. Her superiors protested. She was too valuable, too famous, too symbolic to risk. But Raskova wasn't the kind of woman to watch from a desk. In January 1943, she took command of a new unit, the 125th Guards Bomber Regiment, and prepared to relocate to the front near Stalingrad. But the journey would be her last. On a cold morning, her plane, overloaded and flying through a blizzard, ran out of fuel. They tried to land on the frozen Volga, but the ice cracked beneath them. The crash killed her instantly. When news of her death reached the Night Witches, the airfield fell silent. Many of them had trained under her, idolized her, followed her example. To lose her was like losing their mother, the one who had made their dream possible. Her funeral in Moscow was a state event. Stalin himself attended. But for the women who had flown beside her, the grief became something else. Fuel. That same night, they flew. Their targets were German supply convoys threading through the passes of the Caucasus. The terrain was brutal. Wind currents from the mountains could flip a biplane like a leaf. But the Night Witches didn't care. They dropped their bombs on columns of trucks winding through narrow canyons, lighting the roads below like veins of fire. They came back frostbitten, eyes bloodshot, hands raw from gripping the controls. One of them, Lieutenant Rufina Gasheva, flew her last sortie with a broken leg, strapped to the seat with belts so she could finish the mission. She refused to be sent home. By now, the Germans knew exactly who they were fighting. The 588th was on every intelligence report. Commanders warned their men to stay alert at night. Entire battalions adjusted schedules to avoid sleeping between midnight and dawn. The psychological toll was enormous. Soldiers were terrified to light fires or even whisper after dark. That fear became part of the regiment's power. They began to embrace the title the Germans had given them. Nachthexen, the Night Witches. They painted broomsticks on the noses of their planes. Some added crescent moons. Others drew stars, or tiny witch silhouettes with red scarves. They laughed about it. If the enemy wanted to believe they were witches, then witches they would be. But the laughter often masked exhaustion. By 1944, most of them were running on instinct alone. Their missions had doubled. The raids were closer to enemy lines, often deep into occupied territory. The casualty rate was rising. Each night, as engines sputtered to life, there was always that quiet moment, the pause before takeoff, when someone would glance at an empty tent, a missing face. Sometimes they talked about it. Most of the time, they didn't. The air war was changing. The Soviets had pushed the Germans west, across the Dnieper River. The Night Witches moved with them, setting up new airfields every few weeks, building and breaking camp like ghosts that left no trace. They'd land in open fields, unload tents, dig fuel pits, set up lanterns, and be operational within hours. By nightfall, they were already flying again. Their missions grew bolder. They struck command posts, fuel depots, railway stations, even small towns the Germans had fortified. One pilot, Olga Sanfirova, became famous for threading her plane between two mountains, barely 30 meters apart, to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Another, Marina Raskova, devised new tactics to coordinate dozens of planes across wide distances without radios, relying only on light signals and the color of flares. They weren't just surviving the war. They were rewriting how it was fought. The Luftwaffe grew desperate to destroy them. They laid traps, set decoy lights, even left fake targets glowing on the ground. The Night Witches learned to tell the difference. Real camps had a rhythm, a pulse. The fakes were too perfect, too quiet. Sometimes they flew so low that German soldiers tried to shoot them down with rifles. The women would see muzzle flashes in the dark, like fireflies rising from the ground. And through it all, they kept going. In one famous operation over the Taman Peninsula, the Night Witches flew more than 1,000 missions in a single month, often with no rest between sorties. Their constant harassment disrupted supply lines so severely that German generals called them a plague. But even witches have limits. The endless missions began to wear them down. The laughter at mealtime grew quieter. The letters home took longer to write. New recruits replaced the fallen, but the tents always felt a little emptier. Still, they pressed forward, because the only way out of the war was through it. By late 1944, the Soviet army was advancing toward the Balkans. The Night Witches followed. They flew over Romania, Poland, and into the edges of Germany itself. Every night, they slipped past searchlights, dodged flak, and dropped their bombs on enemy fortifications. Their commander, Bershanskaya, began each mission with the same words: "For Raskova, for the motherland, for each other." And then they'd vanish into the dark, two at a time, engines sputtering, hearts steady, faces pale in the moonlight, heading west toward a sky full of ghosts and fire. By 1944, the tide of war had turned. The Soviet army was no longer retreating. It was advancing, hard and fast, pushing the German war machine westward with a vengeance. But the front lines were still brutal, shifting, unpredictable. Every night the Night Witches followed close behind, chasing the enemy's shadow across a collapsing empire. They no longer needed introductions. Wherever they arrived, soldiers would stop and watch the strange little biplanes rolling across the fields. They looked almost comical beside the sleek metal fighters of the Red Army Air Force. Small, wooden, fragile. But the men on the ground knew what those planes could do. They'd seen the German trenches still smoking at dawn, the wreckage of trains split open like tin cans, the burned-out remains of fuel depots where there had once been thousands of gallons of oil. Those little planes had done that. Their legend had outgrown the regiment itself. To the Soviet press, they were heroes. To the Germans, they were curses. And to each other they were sisters, bound by exhaustion, survival, and something deeper than either could name. The winter of '44 was merciless. Snowstorms swept across the steppe, freezing their tents solid, turning runways into swamps of ice and mud. When the wind picked up, it howled through the fabric wings of the Po-2s like a ghostly voice. Some nights, the engines refused to start at all, and they'd light small fires beneath the cowling just to warm the oil enough to turn. The flames flickered across faces hollowed by fatigue. Every sortie was a battle before it even began. They wrapped their feet in newspaper for insulation, used scarves as makeshift gloves, and shared a single wool blanket between two bunks. When rations ran out, they'd melt snow for water and chew frozen bread until it softened enough to swallow. And yet, when night came, when orders arrived and engines coughed awake, they smiled. Always. It wasn't bravery in the cinematic sense. It was endurance, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, only another mission, another hour, another chance to keep the darkness on their side. By then, most of the regiment's original members were gone. Killed, wounded, or burned out beyond repair. The new recruits who replaced them learned fast. There was no time for mistakes. One wrong turn in the dark, and you'd vanish into the void. Nadezhda Popova, the bright-eyed pilot who had survived 42 bullet holes in one night, was still flying. She had become a veteran at 22, calm under pressure, quick with a grin, adored by her crew. During the summer campaigns in Poland, she met another pilot, Semyon Kharlamov, a tall, soft-spoken man from a neighboring bomber unit. They met between sorties, shared cigarettes and jokes in the thin air before dawn. Sometimes, when their missions overlapped, they'd flash lights at each other across the night sky. Tiny glimmers of life between death and duty. One morning, after a particularly brutal operation over the Vistula, Popova returned to base and learned that Semyon's plane had been shot down. He was missing in action. She didn't cry. Not then. She climbed into her cockpit and flew that same night, dropping bombs on the same coordinates where his aircraft had vanished. Weeks later, she learned he had survived, wounded, but alive. They would see each other again after the war, marry, and spend the rest of their lives together. But at that moment, in the heart of the war, all she could do was keep flying, carrying the hope of his survival like an extra weight in her plane. There were other stories like that. Small, quiet human moments scattered among the explosions, birthdays celebrated with crumbs of bread, photographs tucked into flight jackets, letters written in pencil and never sent. Death was constant, but so was life. In 1944, the regiment was awarded the prestigious title Guards, an honor reserved for units of exceptional valor. They were renamed the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, and every woman in the unit wore the title with pride. For them, it wasn't about rank or reward. It was recognition, proof that they had earned their place among soldiers who once doubted them. That same year, they crossed into German-held territory. The missions grew more dangerous than ever. Anti-aircraft fire was heavier, the skies more crowded, the nights shorter. The Germans, desperate and cornered, fortified every road and village. Spotlights swept the sky like blades. The night witches countered by flying even lower, sometimes barely 10 meters above the ground. They'd feel the heat of explosions under their wings, smell the smoke rising from burning villages as they climbed away. The light from their own bombs flashed against the underside of their planes, revealing faces blackened with soot and eyes that hadn't known true rest in years. They were no longer girls from flight school. They were warriors carved by the night. One of their most harrowing missions came during the push into Poland. A group of pilots, including Yevdokia Nosal, one of the regiment's best navigators, was tasked with destroying a key German supply hub outside Warsaw. They approached at low altitude, gliding silently until the last second. But German gunners had anticipated the strike. The sky lit up with tracer fire. One shell tore through Nosal's cockpit, killing her instantly. Her navigator managed to keep the plane steady and dropped the bombs before crash landing in a field. When they recovered her body, her hands were still on the controls. She was posthumously named a hero of the Soviet Union. The regiment mourned her the only way they knew how, by flying again that night. By 1945, the night witches had become a storm that never stopped moving. They flew over the Oder, across the Polish plains, and into the very heart of Germany. Their names were whispered in German trenches and shouted in Soviet newspapers. They had become a myth made real, women who turned the night itself into a weapon. In the final months of the war, they bombed positions near Berlin, clearing the way for the Red Army's advance. Their targets were fuel depots, rail lines, command posts, anything that kept the German war machine alive. And still, even then, they flew in those same fragile biplanes, the same wooden skeletons that had carried them from the Volga to the Reich. By then, each plane had its own scars, bullet holes patched with canvas, burn marks from near misses, names painted on the sides like old friends. The end of the war came quietly for them. No fanfare, no parades, just one last mission, one last night of flying over a world that was finally burning itself out. When they returned, the dawn was bright and colorless. The airfield smelled of spring and absence. They had survived what no one believed possible. Of the hundreds who joined the regiment, dozens never came home. Those who did were forever changed. Their faces were older than their years, their eyes too deep, their laughter too sharp. But they were alive. When the ceasefire was announced, they stood together in the early morning light, uniforms tattered, hands trembling, not from fear this time, but disbelief. For the first time in 4 years, there was no mission, no orders, no night sky waiting to swallow them whole. And in that strange, almost unbearable quiet, someone began to cry, then another, and another, until the whole regiment was standing there, the night witches of the 46th Guards, crying and laughing under a sky that, at long last, no longer belonged to war. Victory didn't sound like they imagined it would. There were no trumpets, no cheers echoing across the fields, just the distant thunder of artillery fading into silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, only unfamiliar. For the first time in 4 years, the engines stopped. The airfield, that constant hum of motion, metal, and command, was still. The women walked among their planes like ghosts revisiting their own footprints. Each aircraft bore scars of 100 missions, patchwork wings, faded paint, and the soot of 1,000 takeoffs that would never happen again. The war was over. But for the night witches, that didn't mean rest. They had survived what so many hadn't. They had fought harder, flown longer, and risked more than most soldiers ever would. They had done it with no armor, no guns, no radios, only their skill, their instincts, and each other. And yet, when peace finally came, the world didn't quite know what to do with them. The Soviet Union was already moving on, rebuilding, rewriting, celebrating its heroes. The newspapers praised the courage of tank commanders, infantry divisions, fighter aces, but the women of the 46th Guards were quietly disbanded, their planes retired to scrap yards, their names buried in reports and archives. Some went back to school. Some became engineers, teachers, mothers. Some never flew again. A few tried to stay in aviation, but most airfields refused to hire them. The war is over, they were told. Time to let the men return. For women who had flown through gunfire, who had dodged searchlights and buried their friends under the stars, that kind of dismissal cut deeper than shrapnel. They had given everything, and like so many soldiers, they returned to a world that wanted to forget. Even their equipment was stripped away. Their Po-2s, the fragile biplanes that had carried them across continents, were melted down or repurposed for crop dusting. The few that survived were left to rot in backyards and hangars until only their stories remained. But stories are hard to kill. Decades later, when the world began to look back on the war with clearer eyes, historians found them again. The names, the records, the faded photographs. Women standing beside battered biplanes, smiling through exhaustion, faces smudged with oil and pride. The numbers were staggering. Over 23,000 missions, more than 3,000 tons of bombs dropped, and 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the country could give. They had fought for every inch of recognition, and even in silence, they had never lost it among themselves. Nadezhda Popova lived to see her story told again. In interviews, she spoke softly, with that same wry smile she'd carried through the war. When asked what she remembered most, she didn't mention medals or missions. She said, "The wind, the cold, the faces of my friends, and the silence when you turn the engine off and glide. The moment between life and death when the world holds its breath." For her, and for many of the others, the war never really ended. It just changed shape. From the fire in the sky to the quiet in their memories. Some of them met every year after the war. Small reunions in Moscow or Krasnodar or Volgograd. They'd bring old flight jackets and photographs, toast to the ones who didn't come home, and tell the same stories over and over until their voices broke. They called each other by their call signs, their nicknames, their wartime selves, as if saying those names could bring back the girls they once were. The world eventually began to listen. Books were written. Documentaries were filmed. Children grew up learning the name Night Witches, not as a warning whispered by soldiers, but as a song of defiance, proof of what courage looks like when it's told it doesn't belong. Even the Germans, years later, spoke of them with a kind of reluctant awe. One Luftwaffe officer, long after the war, admitted that his men were more afraid of the Night Witches than of the Red Army's artillery. "They came from nowhere," he said. "No sound, no warning, only death from the dark. We hated them, but we respected them, and that, in a way, was their greatest victory. They didn't just defeat an army, they defeated expectation. Every wall built between what they were told they couldn't do and what they proved they could." When people ask why the Germans called them witches, the easy answer is fear, the whisper of their planes, the silent gliding through the night, the way they seemed untouchable. But maybe there was something else to it, too. Maybe those soldiers, staring into the sky, understood that what they were hearing wasn't just the wind through fabric wings. It was something supernatural, not in magic, but in will, a force that couldn't be explained or reasoned with, the kind of power that only comes from believing in something larger than yourself, in a country, in a cause, in the person sitting beside you in the dark. That's what made them witches. That's what made them unstoppable. And though time has scattered their names across history, the echo of their courage still drifts through the air like that old whisper, soft, distant, unforgettable. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The faint rustle of canvas wings, the quiet hum of an engine fading into silence, and then, just before the bombs fall, that sound, that same haunting swish that once froze the hearts of soldiers across the front. The sound of the night witches, the sound of women who turned the darkness into their ally, and left behind a legacy that no one could ever shoot down.